Kale stepped out of the sleek, silver spacecraft with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The air on Earth felt strange to him, thicker, warmer, and filled with unfamiliar scents. He had studied this planet for months before his arrival, but nothing in the textbooks or simulations prepared him for the reality of standing under an open sky painted with soft clouds and sunlight. Around him, the small town of Willow Creek buzzed with activity. People walked along dirt paths, children laughed near a playground, and somewhere in the distance, music played faintly. It all seemed so ordinary. Kale adjusted the translator device clipped to his belt and took a deep breath, or at least what passed for breathing among his kind. As a student from the Vorthak Empire, he was here to observe humans, a species his people dismissed as primitive and chaotic. Warlike, they called them. Yet Kale couldn't help but notice how calm everything appeared. There were no weapons visible, no signs of conflict, just people going about their day, smiling and talking to one another. "Excuse me," came a voice behind him. Kale turned quickly, startled. A man stood there, wearing simple clothes and holding a stack of papers. His name tag read Daniel Carter. "I'm Daniel," the man said, extending a hand. "Welcome to Willow Creek." Kale hesitated. Physical contact wasn't common among the Vorthak, but he'd read that humans used it as a gesture of goodwill. Slowly, he reached out and touched Daniel's hand. It felt odd, soft and warm, but the smile on Daniel's face reassured him. "You're Kale, right?" Daniel asked. When Kale nodded, Daniel continued, "We've been expecting you. I teach history at the local school, and I'll be helping you learn more about us while you're here." Kale tilted his head slightly, studying Daniel. The man didn't seem threatening, but Kale knew better than to trust appearances. Back home, even the friendliest faces could hide hostility. Still, something about Daniel's relaxed demeanor made Kale want to believe him. As they walked through the town, Daniel pointed out landmarks, a bakery, a library, and a park where kids played soccer. Kale listened intently, absorbing every detail. Humans lived in structures made of wood and brick, far simpler than the towering metal buildings on his home planet. But there was a charm to these places, a sense of community that intrigued him. Near the edge of the park, a woman approached them. She had short brown hair and carried a camera around her neck. "Hi, I'm Maya Thompson," she said brightly. "I write for the local paper. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Kale glanced at Daniel, unsure how to respond. Sensing his hesitation, Daniel stepped in. "It's okay. She just wants to know more about your visit." Mia smiled warmly. "So, Kale, what do you think of Earth so far? Is it different from what you expected?" Kale thought carefully before answering. "It is quieter," he said finally. "On my world, we are always preparing for battle. Here, it seems peaceful." Mia raised an eyebrow. "Peaceful? Well, I guess that depends on where you look. Not everyone gets along all the time, but most folks here try to make things work." Kale frowned. Why would they do that? Wouldn't it be easier to fight and win? Mia chuckled softly. "Maybe, but fighting doesn't solve much in the long run. We've learned it the hard way." Her words puzzled Kale. In his culture, winning meant survival, and anything less was weakness. How could humans value cooperation over victory? He decided to keep watching, to see if their behavior matched their claims. For now, though, he simply nodded. "I will learn," he said quietly. And with that, the three of them continued walking, the sun casting long shadows across the ground. Unbeknownst to Kale, this quiet little town would soon challenge everything he thought he knew about strength, courage, and the true meaning of peace. The next morning, Kale found himself sitting in the back of Daniel's classroom, observing a group of teenage students. The room was filled with chatter as the kids settled into their seats, and Kale couldn't help but notice how different they were from young Vorthak. On his home planet, children were trained for combat almost from birth, learning discipline and strategy before they could even speak clearly. Here, These humans seemed carefree, laughing and joking with one another, like there wasn't a worry in the world. Daniel stood at the front of the room, holding up a map covered in lines and symbols. Today, he began, we're going to talk about World War II. Does anyone remember what we discussed last week? A girl in the front row raised her hand eagerly. It was a big war where lots of countries fought each other, she said. But then they made peace after. Cale leaned forward slightly, intrigued. Peace. That wasn't something the Vorthak talked about much. To them, wars ended only when one side completely destroyed the other. The idea of stopping mid-conflict to negotiate sounded strange and weak. Daniel nodded. Good job, Emily. But let's dig deeper. Why do you think the leaders decided to come together and create peace treaties instead of continuing to fight? Another student spoke up. Because fighting wasn't solving anything. People were dying, and no one was really winning. Cale felt a flicker of confusion. No one was winning. How could that be possible? In his mind, every battle had a clear outcome, a victor and a loser. Yet here was an entire class discussing how stopping a war could lead to better results than finishing it. As the lesson continued, Daniel showed pictures of soldiers shaking hands across battlefields, signing documents, and rebuilding cities. He explained how nations work together to prevent future conflicts, creating organizations like the United Nations. Cale listened closely, trying to make sense of it all. It didn't align with anything he'd been taught about power or dominance. After class, Mia joined Cale and Daniel in the hallway. She carried a notebook and pen, ready to jot down notes for her article. So, Cale, she said, what did you think of today's lesson? Cale hesitated. I don't understand. Your people stop fighting because they want peace, even if they are strong enough to win. Mia tilted her head, thinking carefully about her answer. Well, yeah. Winning isn't always the goal. Sometimes, it's better to find a way for everyone to live together without more bloodshed. But why? Cale pressed. Wouldn't it be safer to destroy your enemies so they can never hurt you again? Daniel stepped in, his tone calm but firm. Not really. Destroying someone might end the immediate threat, but it creates new problems. Resentment, fear, revenge. If we can find a way to work things out, it's better for everyone in the long run. Cale frowned, struggling to process this logic. In Vorthak society, showing mercy was seen as a sign of weakness. Enemies weren't given second chances. They were eliminated. Yet these humans spoke of forgiveness and compromise as if they were strengths. Later that afternoon, Cale accompanied Mia to a cafe on Main Street. Over cups of steaming coffee, or in Cale's case, a glass of water, she asked him more questions about his impressions of Earth. You seem surprised by how much we value peace, she said. Is that unusual where you come from? Yes, Cale admitted. My people believe strength comes from defeating others. They see kindness as a flaw. Mia smiled softly. Kindness isn't a flaw. It takes courage to choose peace when you could fight. Maybe your people just haven't learned that yet. Her words lingered in Cale's mind as he walked back to his temporary quarters that evening. He stared out the window at the quiet streets below, watching his family stroll together, and friends greeted one another warmly. For the first time, he wondered if perhaps the Vorthak had been wrong about humanity, and maybe even about themselves. That night, as he lay awake, Cale replayed the day's events in his mind. The students' discussions, Daniel's explanations, Mia's insights, they all painted a picture of a species that valued connection over conquest. It was foreign, yes, but also oddly inspiring. And though he wouldn't admit it aloud, Cale felt a spark of admiration growing within him. Perhaps there was more to strength than simply overpowering your opponent. The following day, Cale attended a community event in Willow Creek's town square. It was a lively gathering, with food stalls lining the streets, musicians playing cheerful tunes, and children running around with balloons. Despite the festive atmosphere, Cale remained cautious. his sharp eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of tension or aggression. He couldn't shake the feeling that something might go wrong. After all, even the most peaceful situations could turn violent in an instant. His suspicions grew when he noticed two men standing near a vegetable stand, their voices rising as they argued. One man, tall and broad-shouldered, gestured angrily toward a patch of land behind him. The other, shorter but equally heated, pointed back, his face red with frustration. Cal tensed, his instincts telling him this was about to escalate into a fight. In his experience, disputes like these always ended in violence. "Daniel," Cal said, turning to the teacher who stood beside him. "What is happening?" Daniel followed Cal's gaze and sighed. "Oh, that. They're arguing over property lines again. Happens every now and then." Cal frowned. "And they will fight?" Daniel shook his head, a small smile forming on his lips. "Not likely. Folks around here don't usually solve problems with their fists." Cal wasn't convinced. He had seen enough conflicts among his own people to know how quickly anger could spiral out of control. His hand drifted instinctively to the device on his belt, a tool capable of emitting a powerful energy pulse. If things got out of hand, he would step in. He couldn't allow harm to come to anyone, not while he was here to observe. But as he watched, something unexpected happened. A woman stepped between the two men, her arms raised in a calming gesture. She spoke firmly but kindly, urging them to lower their voices. To Cal's astonishment, they listened. The taller man took a deep breath, nodding reluctantly, while the shorter one crossed his arms but seemed to relax slightly. "What is she doing?" Cal whispered to Daniel. "She's mediating," Daniel replied, helping them talk it out instead of letting emotions take over. Cal continued to watch as the three of them moved to a nearby bench. The woman pulled out a map and began pointing to specific areas, explaining boundaries and suggesting compromises. Both men listened intently, their earlier hostility fading. After a few minutes, they shook hands, though neither looked particularly happy. Still, the argument was resolved without a single punch thrown. Cal felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. They stopped fighting. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, that's what happens when you focus on finding solutions instead of winning arguments." Mia, who had joined them unnoticed, chimed in. "Humans aren't perfect, Cal. We argue and get upset just like anyone else. But we've learned that cooperation often works better than conflict." Cal didn't respond immediately. He replayed the scene in his mind, trying to reconcile it with everything he'd been taught about strength and dominance. In Vorthak culture, walking away from a challenge, or worse, compromising, was seen as shameful. Yet here were two men who had set aside their differences for the sake of peace. Was this truly weakness, as his people claimed? Or was it something else entirely? That evening, as Cal sat alone in his room, he found himself reflecting on the day's events. He thought about the arguing men, the mediator, and the way the entire situation had unfolded. There had been no threats, no displays of power, no need for physical force. Instead, words and understanding had prevailed. It was unlike anything he'd ever witnessed before. For the first time since arriving on Earth, Cal began to question the lessons drilled into him by his elders. Could there be more to strength than simply overpowering your opponent? Could compassion and cooperation be forms of power too? These questions swirled in his mind, leaving him restless and uncertain, but also strangely hopeful. As he gazed out the window at the quiet town below, Cal realized that his journey was only beginning. Willow Creek still held many mysteries, and he was determined to uncover them all, even if it meant rethinking everything he thought he knew. The next morning, Mia invited Cal to visit a local volunteer center where she spent much of her free time. Curious about this part of human life, Cal agreed to join her. They arrived at a small building near the edge of town, its walls painted a cheerful yellow. Inside, the air buzzed with activity as people moved between tables stacked with food, clothing, and supplies. Some were sorting donations, while others handed out meals to those in need. "This is our community outreach program," Mia explained as they stepped inside. "We help people who are struggling, whether it's because they've lost their jobs, don't have homes, or just need a little extra support." Cale looked around, taking in the scene. He noticed how everyone worked together, their movements efficient yet unhurried. There was no shouting, no sense of urgency that bordered on panic. Instead, the atmosphere felt calm and purposeful. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen among the Vorthek, where efficiency often came at the cost of kindness. Mia led him to a corner of the room where a man stood organizing boxes of canned goods. "Cale, this is Lucas Bennett," she said. "He used to be in the military, but now helps run this place." Lucas turned and offered a warm smile. "Nice to meet you, Cale. Welcome to Willow Creek." Cale nodded politely, though his attention was drawn to the scars on Lucas's hands and face, marks of battles fought long ago. "You were a soldier?" he asked. "I was," Lucas replied, his tone measured. "Served for 10 years before deciding I could do more good here than on the battlefield." Cale tilted his head, puzzled. "Why would you leave fighting? Was it not honorable?" Lucas chuckled softly. "Honor isn't always found in war. Sometimes it's in helping someone get back on their feet after life knocks them down." As they talked, Lucas shared stories from his time in the military. He spoke of dangerous missions and close calls, but also of moments when soldiers showed mercy to their enemies, offering water to wounded foes or sparing lives when they could have ended them. These acts of compassion had stayed with him, shaping his belief that humanity's greatest strength lay in its ability to care for others. "Even in war, we try to minimize suffering," Lucas said. "It's not about glory or conquest. It's about protecting what matters most, people." Cale listened intently, his mind racing. Everything Lucas said contradicted the lessons he'd learned growing up. In Vorthak culture, showing mercy to an enemy was unthinkable, a sign of weakness that could cost you your life. Yet here was a man who had faced death countless times and still believed in the power of compassion. Later, as Cale helped pack bags of groceries, he found himself reflecting on Lucas's words. The humans around him weren't perfect. They argued, made mistakes, and sometimes acted selfishly. But they also went out of their way to help strangers. They gave freely of their time and resources without expecting anything in return. It was a concept foreign to the Vorthek, who valued self-reliance above all else. At one point, a young boy approached Cale shyly, holding out a sandwich wrapped in paper. "For you," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Cale hesitated, unsure what to do. "Thank you," he said finally, accepting the gift. The boy grinned and ran off, leaving Cale standing there, the simple sandwich clutched in his hand. That night, as Cale sat alone in his quarters, he thought about the day's events. He pictured Lucas's scared face, Mia's encouraging smile, and the boy's eager expression. Each interaction had revealed another layer of humanity's complexity, a species capable of both destruction and profound kindness. For the first time, Cale began to see humans not as primitive or weak, but as deeply resilient. Their willingness to choose compassion over conflict wasn't a flaw. It was a strength. And though he didn't fully understand it yet, he knew one thing for certain. The lessons he was learning in Willow Creek would stay with him forever. That evening, Daniel invited Cale to his home for dinner. The small house was cozy, filled with the smell of roasted vegetables and freshly baked bread. As they sat down at the wooden table, Daniel handed Cale a book with a worn cover. "I thought you might like this," he said. "It's one of my favorites." Cale examined the book carefully. The title read *, The Art of Peace *. He turned it over in his hands, feeling its weight. "What is it about?" he asked. "It's about finding harmony in life," Daniel explained. The author believed that true strength comes from understanding and compassion, not from fighting or domination. Cale frowned. "But how can peace be strong? Isn't it easier to win through force?" Daniel smiled gently. Sometimes, yes, but winning through force doesn't always last. When people feel defeated, they often look for ways to fight back. Peace, on the other hand, can bring lasting change. After dinner, Daniel suggested they watch a movie together. They settled onto the couch, and Daniel picked a film about ordinary people risking their lives to save others during a time of great danger. On the screen, families hid strangers in their basements, friends shared scarce food, and neighbors stood up against injustice despite the risks. Cale watched intently, his eyes wide as he absorbed each scene. At one point, a character in the movie said, "We may lose everything, but if we hold on to our humanity, then we haven't truly lost." Cale paused the film, turning to Daniel. "What does that mean, to hold on to humanity?" Daniel thought for a moment before answering. "It means staying true to who we are, even when it's hard. It means choosing kindness, even when fear tells us to do otherwise." Cale nodded slowly, though the idea still felt foreign to him. In Vorthak society, survival came first. Kindness was a luxury few could afford. Yet here were humans, willing to risk their lives for people they barely knew. Why would they do such a thing? Later that night, Cale lay awake in his room, replaying the movie and Daniel's words in his mind. He thought about the characters' sacrifices and how their actions had inspired others to act bravely too. Was this what humans meant by strength? Not the ability to overpower, but the courage to care. The next morning, Cale decided to visit the library. He wanted to learn more about human stories, especially those that explored themes of forgiveness and sacrifice. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Harper, greeted him warmly and helped him find books that matched his interests. She recommended novels, poems, and essays, all filled with tales of hope and resilience. As Cale read, patterns began to emerge. Humans valued connection. They sought to understand one another, even in the face of differences. They forgave mistakes, worked together to overcome challenges, and found beauty in acts of kindness. These weren't weaknesses, they were choices that required immense strength and trust. One afternoon, while flipping through a collection of short stories, Cale came across a tale about two enemies who became friends after being stranded together in a storm. At first, they argued and blamed each other for their predicament. But as the hours passed, they realized survival depended on cooperation. By the time rescuers arrived, they had formed a bond neither expected. Cale closed the book, deep in thought. In Vorthak culture, such an outcome would have been impossible. Enemies remained enemies until one side was destroyed. There was no room for friendship or understanding. Yet here was proof that humans could transcend hatred, not because they were weak, but because they chose to see beyond it. By the end of the week, Cale noticed a shift within himself. His initial skepticism about humanity was fading, replaced by admiration for their capacity to choose peace. He began to wonder, if humans could rise above conflict, why couldn't the Vorthak? What if his own people had misunderstood strength all along? These questions lingered in his mind as he prepared for bed that night. Outside his window, the stars twinkled faintly, reminding him of the vast distance between Earth and his home planet. Yet despite the miles separating them, Cale felt closer to humanity than ever before. Their lessons were beginning to shape him in ways he hadn't anticipated, and he knew there was still so much more to learn. Early one morning, the quiet town of Willow Creek was shaken by an urgent warning. Heavy rains had caused a nearby river to overflow, flooding parts of the area. The streets quickly filled with water, and people scrambled to evacuate their homes. Panic spread through the community, but amid the chaos, Cale noticed something remarkable. Instead of focusing on themselves, the townsfolk immediately began helping one another. Daniel appeared at Cale's door, soaking wet and out of breath. "We need all hands on deck," he said. "The floodwaters are rising fast." Without hesitation, Cale followed Daniel to the center of town, where volunteers were already hard at work. Some carried sandbags to block the advancing water, while others helped families load their belongings into trucks. Maya directed traffic, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Even Lucas was there, organizing teams and ensuring everyone stayed safe. Cale stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the scene. Back home, disasters often led to competition for resources, with individuals prioritizing their own survival above all else. But here, humans worked together as if they were part of a single unit. He didn't understand it. Why would they risk their lives for strangers? Cale. Mia called, snapping him out of his thoughts. We could use your help over here. He hurried toward her, unsure of what to do. She handed him a stack of blankets. Take these to the shelter. They'll be needed for the families who lost their homes. As Cale delivered the blankets, he saw rows of cots set up inside the school gymnasium. Volunteers handed out food and dry clothes, comforting frightened children and reassuring worried parents. The sense of unity was palpable, and for the first time, Cale felt a pang of guilt. On his planet, such cooperation would have been unthinkable. Survival was seen as an individual achievement, not a shared effort. Later that afternoon, a cry rang out near the flooded park. A child had slipped into the rising waters and was struggling to stay afloat. Without thinking, Cale sprinted toward the sound. His heart pounded as he waded into the cold, rushing current, the weight of the water pulling against him. Using his advanced strength, he reached the boy just in time, lifting him safely onto dry land. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Cale barely heard them. He knelt beside the child, checking to make sure he was unharmed. When the boy looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes and whispered, "Thank you," Cale felt something stir deep within him, a warmth he couldn't explain. That evening, as the rain finally slowed, the townspeople gathered to assess the damage. Homes were ruined, cars submerged, and possessions lost. But no lives had been taken, thanks to their collective efforts. Cale watched silently as neighbors consoled each other, promising to rebuild what had been destroyed. It was a stark contrast to the aftermath of disasters on his world, where blame and anger usually followed. Mia approached him, holding a cup of hot tea. "How are you holding up?" she asked. I don't know," Cale admitted. "I've never seen anything like this before. My people wouldn't act this way. They would fight for themselves, not for others." Mia smiled softly. "Humans aren't perfect, Cale. We make mistakes, and sometimes we let fear get the better of us. But when it really matters, we remember that we're stronger together." Her words lingered in his mind long after she walked away. That night, as Cale sat alone in his room, he replayed the day's events over and over. He thought about the boy he had saved, the volunteers working tirelessly, and the families comforting one another. For the first time, he understood why humans avoided war whenever possible. It wasn't because they were weak, but because they valued life too much to destroy it unnecessarily. Cale realized that his time on Earth was changing him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The lessons he learned in Willow Creek were challenging everything he believed about strength, courage, and compassion. And though he still had questions, one thing was clear: humanity's capacity to choose peace wasn't a flaw. It was their greatest strength. The next morning, Cale sat at the edge of the flooded park, watching as the water slowly receded. The town of Willow Creek was battered but not broken. People moved about with purpose, cleaning up debris and checking on their neighbors. Despite the destruction, there was a sense of hope in the air, a quiet determination to rebuild what had been lost. Cale pulled out his journal and began writing. His pen hovered over the page for a moment before he started. "Humans are unlike any species I have ever encountered," he wrote. "They face hardship, yet they choose to stand together instead of turning against one another. They value life above all else, even when it requires great sacrifice." As he wrote, Mia joined him, sitting cross-legged on the grass nearby. "What are you working on?" she asked curiously. Cale glanced up. "A report for my superiors. They expect me to explain what I've learned about humans during my stay here." Mia raised an eyebrow. And what will you tell them? Cale hesitated, unsure how to put his thoughts into words. Finally, he said, I will tell them that humans avoid war because they believe in compassion. They see strength not in domination, but in cooperation. It's different from what I was taught. Mia smiled faintly. Do you think they'll believe you? I don't know, Cale admitted. My people value power and control. To them, kindness is a weakness. But after everything I've seen here, I can't agree anymore. For a long time, Cale had believed the Vorthak way of life was the only path to survival. Now, he wasn't so sure. The humans of Willow Creek had shown him another way, a way built on trust, empathy, and shared effort. He couldn't unsee what he had witnessed, and he didn't want to. Later that day, Daniel invited Cale to join him for a walk along the riverbank. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the water. As they strolled, Daniel spoke about resilience. Floods like this happen every few years, he said. It's tough, but we always bounce back. We take care of each other, and that makes all the difference. Cale nodded thoughtfully. You don't give up easily. No, we don't, Daniel replied. Life isn't about avoiding pain or struggle. It's about finding meaning in the hard times and learning from them. Cale absorbed these words, letting them sink in. On his planet, struggles were often met with aggression. Conflicts resolved through force rather than understanding. But here, humans embraced challenges as opportunities to grow closer, to strengthen their bonds. It was a perspective Cale had never considered before. That night, Cale sent his report back to the Vorthak Empire. In it, he described humanity's unique approach to conflict resolution, their emphasis on compassion, and their ability to unite in times of crisis. He included details about the flood, highlighting how the townspeople had worked together to protect one another. He ended the message with a bold statement. If we wish to evolve as a species, we must learn from the humans. Their strength lies not in weapons, but in their hearts. When Cale received a response days later, it was dismissive. His superiors accused him of being naive, claiming that humans were merely hiding their true nature. They are primitive. The message read, their so-called compassion is a facade. Do not be deceived. Cale stared at the screen, disappointment weighing heavily on him. He had hoped his findings would inspire change, but instead, they had been rejected outright. Still, he refused to let their skepticism deter him. He knew what he had seen, and he knew it was real. Over the following days, Cale continued to reflect on his experiences. He realized that while he might not be able to change the minds of his superiors overnight, he could plant seeds of doubt. If enough Vorthak questioned their rigid beliefs, perhaps they could begin to see the value in humanity's way of life. As Cale prepared to leave Earth, he felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Sadness because he would miss the warmth and kindness of the people who had welcomed him so openly. Gratitude because they had taught him lessons he would carry with him forever. On his final night in Willow Creek, Cale stood outside under the stars, gazing at the vast expanse above. For the first time, he allowed himself to dream of a future where both humans and Vorthak could coexist, not as enemies, but as allies. It was a distant hope, but one worth striving for. And as he boarded his spacecraft the next morning, Cale vowed to keep sharing humanity's story, no matter how long it took for others to listen. Cale's return to his home planet was met with skepticism and disbelief. The towering crystalline structures of the Vorthak capital gleamed under artificial light, a stark contrast to the warm, earthy tones of Willow Creek. As he stepped out of his spacecraft, he was immediately surrounded by officials in sleek uniforms, their expressions cold and calculating. They had read his report but were unwilling to accept its conclusions. You claim humans are compassionate, one of the council members said during a formal hearing, his voice dripped with disdain. Yet history shows they have waged countless wars. How can you call them peaceful? Cale stood tall, though he felt uneasy under their piercing gazes. Humans fight, yes, he replied calmly. but they also seek peace. They learn from their mistakes and strive to avoid repeating them. Their greatest strength is not in their weapons, but in their ability to choose compassion over conflict. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Another council member leaned forward, her tone sharp. "You speak as if kindness is a virtue. Among our people, it is a flaw, a sign of weakness." Cale hesitated, searching for the right way to explain what he had learned. "Kindness is not weak," he said finally. "It takes courage to show mercy when you could destroy your enemy. It takes strength to work together instead of tearing each other apart. Humans understand this. That's why they survive, not through force alone, but through connection." The council exchanged skeptical glances, clearly unconvinced. To them, Cal's observations sounded like excuses for human frailty. They dismissed his arguments, labeling him as overly influenced by emotional propaganda during his stay on Earth. Despite their rejection, Cal refused to give up. Over the following weeks, he began sharing his experiences with younger members of his species, students, apprentices, and curious individuals who hadn't yet been hardened by the rigid beliefs of Vorthak society. He told them about Daniel's lessons, Mita's insights, Lucas's stories, and the flood that brought an entire town together. He showed them images of humans helping one another, working side by side, and choosing cooperation over aggression. At first, many were hesitant to listen. The idea of valuing compassion over dominance went against everything they had been taught. But slowly, some started to question the status quo. A young apprentice named Lyra approached Cal after one of his talks. "I've always believed that strength means winning," she admitted. "But now I wonder, maybe there's more to it than that." Cal smiled faintly. "There is," he said. "Strength isn't just about power or control. It's about making choices that benefit everyone, not just yourself." Inspired by Cal's words, Lyra began spreading his message among her peers. Soon, small groups of young Vorthak started meeting secretly to discuss alternative ways of resolving conflicts. They imagined a future where their society might prioritize understanding over destruction, unity over division. It was a fragile movement, vulnerable to suppression, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Cal faced increasing pressure from the council to abandon his advocacy. He was warned that continuing to promote human ideals would jeopardize his standing within the Empire. Yet he remained steadfast, knowing that change rarely came without resistance. One evening, as Cal walked alone through the dimly lit corridors of the capital city, he thought about Willow Creek. He remembered the laughter of children playing in the park, the warmth of Daniel's hospitality, and the resilience of the townspeople during the flood. Those memories fueled his determination to keep pushing for progress, no matter how daunting the challenge. Though the road ahead would be difficult, Cal knew he wasn't alone. Seeds of doubt had been planted, and even if they grew slowly, they held the promise of transformation. For the first time in his life, Cal felt hope, not just for humanity, but for his own people as well. Perhaps one day, the Vorthak would come to see that true strength lay not in domination, but in the courage to embrace peace. And until then, Cal vowed to keep telling humanity's story, trusting that its lessons would eventually take root. The day before Cal's departure from Earth, the people of Willow Creek threw him a farewell party. It was held in the same park where he had first witnessed their unity during the flood. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across picnic tables laden with food and drinks. Laughter and music filled the air as townsfolk gathered to celebrate the alien who had become part of their community. Daniel stood up to speak, raising a glass in Cal's direction. "We may not understand everything about your world," he said warmly, "but you've given us a glimpse into yours. And we hope you'll carry a piece of ours back with you." Cal nodded, touched by the gesture. He hadn't expected such kindness when he arrived, but now it felt impossible to leave without feeling change. As Daniel handed him a wrapped gift, a book titled Asterisk, The Art of Peace Asterisk, Cal realized how much these humans had taught him about strength, courage, and compassion. Maya stepped forward next, holding out a small photo album. Inside were pictures from his time in Willow Creek, images of him helping at the volunteer center, standing beside Lucas during the flood cleanup, and even laughing awkwardly while trying human snacks at the cafe. Each photo captured moments that reminded Kel of how far he'd come since his arrival. "We wanted you to have something to remember us by," Maya said softly. "You've made a big impact here, Kel. Don't forget that." Her words brought an unexpected lump to his throat. On his home planet, emotions were often seen as distractions, or worse, weaknesses, but here, they were embraced as part of what made life meaningful. For the first time, Kel allowed himself to fully feel the weight of gratitude and connection. As the evening wore on, others approached him to share their goodbyes. Children tugged at his sleeves, asking if he would ever return. Older residents patted his shoulder, thanking him for lending a hand during the flood. Even strangers who had never spoken to him directly offered smiles and nods of appreciation. It was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. That night, as Kel packed his belongings for the journey home, he paused to look at the gifts he'd been given. The book from Daniel symbolized the lessons he'd learned about finding peace within chaos. The photo album from Mia represented the bonds he'd formed with people who once seemed so different from him. Together, they served as reminders of the humanity he hoped to bring back to his own world. When morning came, Kel walked to the edge of town where his spacecraft waited. A small group had gathered to see him off, including Daniel, Mia, Lucas, and several others. As he climbed aboard, he turned to face them one last time. "I will never forget what you've shown me," he said sincerely. "Your compassion has changed me in ways I didn't think possible. I promise to share your story with anyone willing to listen." The crowd cheered softly, waving as the spacecraft's engines roared to life. Kel watched through the window as Willow Creek grew smaller and smaller, until it disappeared entirely beneath the clouds. Though sadness lingered in his heart, he also felt a deep sense of purpose. He carried with him not just memories, but a mission to challenge the beliefs of his people and inspire them to consider another path. Hours later, as the ship entered the vast silence of space, Kel opened the photo album. Flipping through its pages, he saw faces full of resilience and kindness. These were people who chose to work together instead of tearing each other apart. They valued cooperation over conquest and empathy over aggression. Their example gave him hope, not just for the future of the Vorthek, but for all beings capable of change. Kel closed the album and gazed out at the endless expanse of stars. Somewhere among them lay his home planet, still bound by old traditions and rigid ideologies. But somewhere else, on a tiny blue world called Earth, was proof that another way of living was possible. And though the road ahead would be difficult, Kel knew he wasn't alone. Humanity's spirit traveled with him, lighting the way forward. Back on his home planet, Kel found himself facing resistance at every turn. The Council dismissed his reports as naive and misguided, refusing to acknowledge the value of humanity's approach to conflict. Publicly, they labeled his observations as dangerous ideas that could weaken the Vorthek Empire. Privately, however, whispers of doubt began to spread. Younger members of society, inspired by Kel's stories, started questioning the rigid beliefs they had grown up with. In classrooms and training grounds, debates sparked about whether dominance was truly the only measure of strength. Some apprentices openly wondered if compassion might be a better path to survival. Though these conversations were often hushed and cautious, they signaled the beginning of change. Lyra, the young apprentice who had first approached Kel after one of his talks, became a quiet leader among her peers. She organized secret meetings where they discussed human concepts like forgiveness, cooperation, and empathy. They imagined what their world might look like if the Vorthek prioritized understanding over aggression. It was a fragile movement, vulnerable to suppression, but it was growing. Slowly, steadily, Kel continued to share his experiences, despite the backlash. He spoke at gatherings, wrote essays, and even created visual presentations showing footage of humans working together during crises like the flood in Willow Creek. His efforts earned him ridicule from many, but also respect from a few. Over time, more people began listening, not just the young, but some older Vorthak who had grown weary of constant conflict. One day, Kale received an unexpected message from a high-ranking officer named Commander Vela. Known for her strict adherence to tradition, she summoned him to her office under the guise of reprimanding him further. But when Kale arrived, he found her sitting quietly, staring at a projection of Earth spinning silently in the air. "I've read your reports," she said finally, her voice softer than usual. "And I've seen the unrest your words have caused among our youth." Kale braced himself for criticism, but Vela surprised him. "Tell me this. Do you truly believe humanity's methods could work for us? Or are you simply idealizing them because they're different?" Kale thought carefully before answering. "I don't think their way is perfect," he admitted. "They struggle, argue, and make mistakes just like we do. But they choose peace when they can. They see strength not in destruction, but in connection. And yes, I believe we could learn from that." Vela was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Perhaps it's time we reconsider some things," she said. "Not because we are weak, but because we are strong enough to try something new." Though Vela didn't openly support Kale's cause, her subtle shift in perspective gave others courage to speak out. More voices joined the conversation, challenging old norms and proposing reforms. Ideas once deemed radical began to take root, sparking discussions that reached even the highest levels of leadership. Meanwhile, light years away, the people of Willow Creek went about their lives unaware of the ripple effect their actions had created. Daniel taught his students about history and hope. Maya wrote articles highlighting acts of kindness in the community. Lucas continued helping those in need at the volunteer center. Their ordinary lives carried extraordinary lessons, lessons that traveled across galaxies and planted seeds of change. Kale often thought about them, especially on quiet nights when the weight of his mission felt overwhelming. He remembered their resilience, their laughter, and their unwavering belief in the power of compassion. Those memories kept him going, reminding him why he had chosen this path. Years later, as reforms began to reshape Vorthak society, Kale looked up at the stars and smiled. Somewhere out there, a small blue planet spun peacefully, its people unaware of how much they had inspired. Humanity's story had become a beacon, a reminder that true strength lies not in force, but in the courage to choose peace. And though the journey was far from over, Kale knew the seeds of change had been sown.